Grease 2. There aren't many sequels to musicals, and this hunk of crap proves why. Grease 2 is one of those musicals that just tries way too hard to be as catchy as the first film and winds up failing in the process. The music isn't as catchy, the lyrics are garbage, and the main plot line is the same as the first film, except the roles are switched, to where the female lead is the badass and the male is the British student, lazily written as Sandy's cousin. You want to know how screwed up this movie is? They actually started filming before the script was actually complete. What film does that? How can you even start filming without a complete script? If I had to give this film any margin of credit, it's to Patricia Birch's direction. Since she had experience with music and theater and was well known for directing as well, the musical numbers and dance sequences are beautifully shot. But that's only one small saving grace when the music itself is complete crap. So overall, watch the first movie, it's much better. Number 9. Santa Claus the Movie. I hate this movie. I pretty much said all that I feel about this flick in my top 10 worst Christmas movies and specials. It's one of those movies that you would think would have a great story. All this had to be was the story of Santa Claus. That was it. It should have been a kind-hearted story with no villain. Instead, they ruined the whole thing by throwing in an over-the-top villain and sending the story in a direction that made no sense. There's really not much more I can say about this movie. It's crap. Number 8. Halloween 5. By this point, the Halloween franchise was kind of in the same boat as the Nightmare on Elm Street and the Friday the 13th franchises were in. It was just a barrage of pointless sequels that had no real reason for being made other than cashing in on a franchise. However, to Halloween's credit, Halloween 4 was actually a really good movie by sequel standards, so a lot of people were able to forgive that one rather easily. However, a mere 1 year later, Halloween 5 was released, and it was clear that they rushed into this project without even trying to perfect a great story for it. The story kind of continues from where Halloween 4 left off. Jamie is in a hospital after stabbing her mother and is now a mute for some reason. Instead of making her the killer like they hinted at in 4, which would have been actually rather interesting, they just make it out to where she sort of sees Michael's actions in her mind and feels it every time he kills someone. It sounds interesting, but the entire story is dwarfed by the violence and blood, which was and still is a common problem in horror films. There's a reason why the director of this film, Dominique Girard, hasn't seen a lot of work over the years. He constantly goes for more blood over story and doesn't seem to know how to tell a story properly. So with Halloween 5, it's just one of those sequels that faded straight into the background, and for good reason. Number 7. Caddyshack 2. I'm not gonna lie, I love the idea of a sequel to Caddyshack. It's one of very few movies that seem destined for a sequel. Initially, it seemed like a good idea because at first, Harold Ramis was back to write it, and Rodney Dangerfield was slated to be back to star in it. So everything seemed in place. However, during the writing process, Dangerfield had gotten into an argument with the studio and backed out of the project. After learning this, Harold Ramis also backed out, and an unknown writer came in to finish up the script, and a new director was also brought in. In the end, we got a half-assed sequel that clearly had no finished story and no real direction. This is one of those movies where everyone asks the same question, like, what could it have been with Dangerfield still in it, or if Harold Ramis had stayed on to write it? And the simple answer to those questions is, a hell of a lot better than this! Warner Brothers should have just let the project die after everyone had backed out, because they were still in the writing process when everyone left, so no principal photography was ever shot. So they might have spent a little bit of money on the writing process, but it sure as hell wasn't a long enough time to where they had invested so much that they had no choice but to continue. So I really don't get Warner Brothers' decision. It made no sense back then, and it makes even less sense today. Number 6. All of the Friday the 13th sequels. I'm just going to be quite honest to everyone, and I think I've said this before, Friday the 13th was never one of my favorite flicks. I always felt it was a film that tried too hard to capitalize on the slasher genre that was getting bigger and bigger back then. There was just this huge list of films that were trying to make money on this growing genre, and all of them had the same concept, gore over story. However, to Friday the 13th's credit, there was a legit story to the whole thing, which did save it from fading into the darkness like so many other slasher films at the time. However, the sequels have no excuse. They're all awful in my opinion, and all of them were incredibly rushed. Literally, a total of 7 sequels released from 1981 to 1989. That is just overkill. And each film grossed less and less money at the box office, which begged the question on why they released so many films so quickly. There's a common question when it comes to horror films, and that's why studios release so many films in that genre, and it's mainly because horror films are the least expensive to make 99% of the time, which means that they have a better chance on making all of their money back, unlike bigger budgeted films. Also, a horror film, depending on how simple it is, also has the least chance on going over budget, so horror films are kind of a studio's best friend in a way as far as budget and return is concerned. But does that mean that they're all good movies? Hell no, and all of the Friday the 13th sequels are legit crap in my view. Number 5. The Fly 2. I loved the first Fly film with Jeff Goldblum. It was such a great film in terms of story, acting, and makeup design that it was just a great part of film history, and it's still a film that I like to watch today. With The Fly 2, they got one of those elements right, but nothing else. Chris Wallace, who handled the creature effects for the first film, pulled double duty for this movie, not only supervising the effects, but also directing the film. I have an unbelievable amount of respect for Chris Wallace for the creature effects that he managed to pull off in film. Films like Gremlins, The Fly, House 2, and he was also the creature effect consultant on Return of the Jedi. So he's a genius in that department, and it's really unfortunate that he's found very little work lately thanks to the rapid growth of CGI. And in many ways, creature effects artists who were so prominent in the 70s and 80s are now in the same boat as old school cartoon animation artists, but that's totally off the topic. With Chris Wallace, as good of an effects artist as he is, he's not a director, and that proves all too true when you look at films like Fly 2. I'm sure the script sounded good, and there are moments in the film where you do see some good ideas pop up, but are not fully utilized. But he just cannot bring it to life with his really laid-back direction style. In Fly 2's case, it's one of those films that's more disappointing than anything else. It's not like other horror sequels where you kind of have a clue it's going to be bad. This movie showed a lot of promise, but the story is not fully realized. And it seems as though they try to use up a lot of makeup and effects to cover up the fact that they don't have a complete story to tell. So overall, it looked promising, but it just doesn't live up to the hype. Number 4. Superman 4. Oh, this is awful. This is just awful. Superman 4 is one of those movies that probably could have been better if a high school student had done it. Even to this day, I still think this is the laziest effort I've ever seen as far as comic book films are concerned. And I went to see Batman and Robin in theaters. I pretty much discussed this film during my top 10 worst comic films so far, but it still baffles me on how bad this turned out. The story is about Superman facing Nuclear Man, a villain that did not exist in the comics and was probably the laziest villain I've ever seen written in any film. Out of all the comic films that I've seen, Superman 4 probably had the saddest production. It was the 4th film in a very successful series from a commercial standpoint, and even the 3rd film, despite its lukewarm reception, was still a box office hit, which begged the question on why such little money was brought into the production. Golan and Globus Productions, which was part of Canon Films at the time, had so many productions going on that they had to split the money between all of them, but no special consideration was made for Superman 4, which made no sense. Sidney Furie, who directed Superman 4, was the biggest disappointment to me. I have a lot of respect for Furie and his low-budget film work because he finds a way to work around the constraints of budget and still make it work, in the same ways that John Carpenter does. However, Superman 4, he got really lazy, making the simplest shots look completely awful. I can't harp on this forever. It's just an awful film that literally put the series on hiatus for nearly 20 years. Number 3. Jaws: The Revenge, or Jaws 4 for those who actually kept count, because apparently the creators lost count because they advertised this as the 3rd film in the trilogy, when it actually is the 4th. Why on earth they decided to ignore the fact that Jaws 3 existed is beyond me. I know Jaws 3D was bad, but it surely wasn't as bad as this. It's the same plot as before, Jaws terrorizing a beach, and you'd think that would be simple enough. But they create elements to the plot that are so sketchy and create so many plot holes in the story that you lose interest really fast. Them completely erasing Jaws 3's existence is continuity error number 1, and the biggest problem is the fact that the main character Ellen is having flashbacks from the first film, when she was not even part of the first film. I think the weirdest part about the movie is that it has some really great actors attached to it, like Lauren Gray and Michael Caine. These veteran actors try their best, and I'm a huge Michael Caine fan, but there isn't anything that they can do to really save the film. It's not worth the time of even the most devoted horror film fan. Number 2. Star Trek V: The Final Frontier. Good lord, most of this list has been devoted to sequels. But that actually speaks a lot about the 80s, because a lot of the 80s was filled with really bad sequels, and it's unfortunate that one decade can have so many. Star Trek V always felt more like a comedy to me than an actual serious action movie. It was written far more campy than any of the other films, and it just came off wrong. I don't mind a little bit of humor, but this went way overboard. To top it all off, the film suffers from the same problem that the first film suffered from. It was way too much of a singular plot that seemed better fit for a show than a film. However, if I had to pick a fault that really screams out more than any other, it's William Shatner himself as the writer and director. Don't get me wrong, I have a tremendous amount of respect for Shatner as an actor, but whenever he writes and directs something, it always turns out weird. For instance, his most recent film, The Captains, which was marketed as being about all of the captains of Star Trek in order. But what it turned out to be was William Shatner, Patrick Stewart, William Shatner, Avery Brooks, William Shatner, Kate McGrew, William Shatner, etc., etc. Star Trek V comes off more like a parody, but with all of the same actors. It almost doesn't look like it's part of the same series. It's unfortunate, but sadly, it's true. And number 1, Garbage Pail Kids. Oh my god, why do I have to be a fan of the Nostalgia Critic? All he does is influence me to watch movies that he found bad, just to see if they really are that bad. And I can honestly say that no movie touches Garbage Pail Kids in terms of awfulness. Do you want to know how bad this film really is? Not one single person who worked on this film have careers anymore. The only one who still had a somewhat decent career after this was Anthony Newley, who played Captain Manzini, because he actually was a really good actor and writer. In fact, the songs from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, he had a pretty big hand in, but sadly Newley passed away in 1999 of cancer. Garbage Pail Kids couldn't have been made on a more stupid idea. They took a deck of trading cards and tried to turn it into a feature-length film. I can understand someone trying to do it to a cartoon and a book, but trading cards? Really? What kind of story can possibly come from a deck of trading cards? And Garbage Pail Kids easily answers that question. A stupid one. There's no effort whatsoever by the creators. The costume designs for the Garbage Pail Kids are hideous, and the voice acting for them is god-awful. However, the rest of the cast is no better. Mackenzie Astin as Dodger has no emotion in his performance whatsoever, and the entire cast of older kids wouldn't even make it on Saved by the Bell. So overall, stay far, far away from Garbage Pail Kids. So that's another decade down. Tune in next week as I take a look at the top 10 best and worst films of the 1990s. Well, everyone, that's it for now. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.